The desperate cry on a barren planet far from Earth. The wind howled like a wild animal, tearing through the desolate landscape. The sky, darkened with swirling clouds, seemed to press down on the land. There was no sign of life except for a small, broken shelter on the edge of the desert, barely standing against the fierce wind. Inside, an alien mother, Zephyra, knelt beside her child, who lay weak and pale on a makeshift bed made of tattered cloth. Her child, a young alien boy, was burning with fever. His skin, usually a soft shade of blue, had turned a sickly gray. His breaths came in shallow gasps, and his small body trembled uncontrollably. Zephyra's heart clenched as she gently brushed his hair away from his face. The sound of his labored breathing broke her heart, but there was nothing she could do. She had already used the last of her medicine, a small vial that was meant to last weeks, but had been exhausted in just a few days. She could feel her own strength fading, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let her child die, not here. Not like this. Zephyra had been abandoned by her people, left to fend for herself on this harsh, unforgiving planet. The disease had spread quickly, killing off the population of her species. She was one of the last survivors, and now, her only family, the one thing she had left, was slipping away from her. She had tried everything to find help. She had sent distress signals, but no one had answered. The cold reality settled in. No one cared. No one would come. But Zephyra refused to give up. She cradled her child in her arms, tears streaming down her face. She whispered softly to him in her native tongue, words filled with love and sorrow, but he couldn't hear her anymore. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, and he weakly reached for her, his small hand brushing her face. His lips moved, but only a whisper escaped. "Mom," he breathed. Zephyra leaned down, pressing her forehead to his. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't leave you, little one." She could feel his tiny heartbeat slowing, each beat heavier than the last. She didn't know how much time they had left. She had no more medicine, no more resources. She had nothing left to offer. She couldn't help him. Desperation surged through her as she looked out through the cracked walls of the shelter. The storm outside raged, the sand whipping through the air, blocking out the stars. She had always believed in the stars, believed that somehow they would guide her people home, but now they seemed like distant, cold strangers. In her desperation, Zephyra did something she never thought she would do. She stood up, clutching her child tightly against her chest, and staggered toward the door. She opened it, and the full force of the storm hit her in the face, but she didn't care. The cold winds tore at her skin, but she barely felt it. She stepped into the open, into the howling sandstorm, holding her son tight. She called out to the universe, to anyone who might hear. Her voice cracked with the weight of her plea. "Help me. Please, someone, anyone, save my child. Help." Her words were carried away by the wind, lost in the chaos. Zephyra dropped to her knees, clutching her son. The storm screamed around her, but it was as if the universe itself had turned its back on her. The wind only howled louder, mocking her desperation. She was about to give up, to surrender to the storm and the fate she could not change. But just as the thought crossed her mind, she heard something she hadn't expected. A sound, a voice, distant but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps in the sand, crunching through the storm, coming toward her. She raised her head, her heart pounding in her chest. Through the haze of sand and wind, she saw a figure, someone or something, walking toward her, moving with purpose. The figure was human, unmistakably so, though she couldn't see the details. She could barely make out the outline, but in that moment, it didn't matter. She had heard something she thought was impossible, a human on her world, in the middle of nowhere, during a storm that had made survival nearly impossible. Could this be the help she had been waiting for? Was it real, or was it another trick of her tired mind? The figure moved closer, and Zephyra felt a flicker of hope. something she hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. She hugged her son tighter, as if willing him to stay alive just a little longer. She stood up, shaking with exhaustion, and stepped forward into the storm, reaching out for the person who might save them. The wind howled louder as the figure drew near. The world around her seemed to stop, the storm pausing in reverence. Then, as the human came into full view, Zephyr could see his face, a soldier, weary but determined. He was there, in the middle of this hellish storm, walking toward her and her child. His presence was an answer to her prayer. Her desperate cry had been heard, but would he save them? A soldier's dilemma. Derek had been walking for hours, his eyes squinting against the storm, the sand burning his skin like tiny needles. His mission had gone wrong, badly wrong. His ship was stranded, communications were down, and his team was nowhere to be found. Alone, with no backup and no clear path to safety, Derek had wandered, hoping to find shelter. But what he hadn't expected, what he couldn't have prepared for, was finding something or someone so completely out of place in this hellish landscape. The cry came again, cutting through the wind. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the storm. It was a voice, a scream, desperate and raw, carried by the gusts. Derek froze. He had been trained for combat, to survive on hostile worlds. He was used to dangers, to the unknown, but this was something different. This was a plea, a cry for help, piercing through the swirling chaos around him. Derek took a step forward, the sound of the storm deafening as it rattled against his suit. He paused, his fingers twitching toward the weapon at his side. It was instinct, a reflex ingrained in him. Should he ignore the cry? Should he keep walking, keep moving forward as his training taught him? Every soldier had been told the same thing. Don't get involved. Don't waste your time with alien lives. You're here for the mission. But another part of him, something deeper, tugged at his chest. He could feel it, the weight of the decision. A human life, no matter who it belonged to, deserved something more. In this unforgiving desert, could he really turn his back on someone in need? He clenched his jaw, his resolve wavering. The storm was swallowing the landscape whole, and every instinct told him to keep moving, to stay focused. But then the cry came again, sharper this time, full of terror and sorrow. It felt like it was calling directly to him. Derek turned, started walking in the direction of the sound. Each step felt heavier than the last, but something in him refused to stop, refused to turn away. The wind lashed at his face, and the sand stung his eyes, but he pressed forward. His heart pounded in his chest, urging him to move faster. He had no idea what he would find, no idea who or what was out there, but the pull of that voice, of the helplessness in it, was too strong. He reached the edge of the small shelter just as the last rays of the fading light cut through the storm, casting a faint glow over the alien woman who knelt in front of him, holding a small child in her arms. She looked at him with wide, desperate eyes. Her skin, a pale blue that shimmered faintly in the stormlight, was streaked with dirt, and her hands trembled as she held her son close. The child, a small alien with dark eyes and features like his mother's, lay motionless, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Derek's first instinct was to pull out his weapon, to prepare for an attack, but the alien woman's eyes held him frozen. There was nothing hostile in her gaze, nothing but fear. And something else, something Derek couldn't quite place, something human. "Help him," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "Please." Derek's throat tightened. His first reaction was to reach for his medical kit, but he knew it was a futile gesture. He had supplies, but they were for injuries, nothing that could treat an alien sickness. He was a soldier, not a medic, and this wasn't his fight. He had no experience with alien diseases. He had no idea what to do, but the silent plea in her eyes made him take another step forward, closer to her. You've been here alone?" Derek asked, his voice rough, unsure of what to say. The alien nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "We are alone. My people, they are gone," she whispered. "I've tried everything. The medicine, it's not enough." Derek could feel the weight of her words. She wasn't just speaking of survival. She was speaking of hope, of a world lost and a family hanging by a thread. The world he had come from, the human world, didn't know this kind of pain. It didn't know what it was like to lose everything. "Why didn't you call for help?" Derek asked, his words laced with confusion. "I did," she said, her voice breaking. "No one came." Derek's heart squeezed, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his decision to step away from his mission. He could have kept walking, could have stayed focused on the task at hand, but something inside of him had made him stop. Now he could feel that something stirring deeper. The alien mother didn't want pity. She didn't need empty promises. She needed a way to save her child, and Derek realized something important. She wasn't asking for much, just a chance. A simple chance to hold on a little longer. Derek didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing: he couldn't turn his back on her now. The encounter, the sandstorm raged on, but in the small crumbling shelter, time seemed to slow. Derek stood still, feeling the weight of the alien mother's gaze, her desperate eyes searching his face as if trying to read his every thought. He could hear the wind howling outside, but inside the shelter, there was only silence, broken only by the soft, labored breaths of the child in her arms. Zephra's pale blue skin glistened faintly in the dim light, her trembling fingers still clutching her son as if she could will him to survive. Derek's mind raced as he tried to think of something, anything he could do to help. His mind was a blur of conflicting thoughts. This wasn't his mission, and it was foolish to stay. But when he looked at the alien mother, holding her child like a fragile treasure, something deep inside him stirred. Compassion, yes, but more than that. A sense of duty, a calling. You need medicine?" Derek finally asked, his voice unsure but firm. Zephra nodded, her eyes pleading. "I need it for him," she whispered, gesturing to the child, whose breathing was shallow, each exhale sounding like a struggle. "He's dying. I've tried everything I know." Derek glanced at his medical kit, but all it contained were basic supplies. Bandages, a few painkillers, antiseptics. There was nothing in it that could help an alien child with an unknown sickness. Nothing that could help a life so fragile, so desperate. But that didn't stop him from feeling an overwhelming need to act. He moved closer, kneeling beside her. The child's eyes flickered open for a moment, locking onto Derek's with a deep, trusting gaze. Derek could see the fear in the boy's eyes, the same fear that Zephra had. They were both fighting for survival in a world that seemed determined to take everything from them. Derek's heart ached as he placed a hand on the boy's forehead, feeling the heat radiating from him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not knowing what else to say. He wanted to reassure her, tell her he could fix everything. But he knew he couldn't, not with what he had. But then something remarkable happened. Zephra looked at him, her tear-filled eyes meeting his, and for the first time, Derek saw something beyond the desperation. There was trust. An alien mother in the middle of a storm, stranded on a desolate world, trusting a human she'd never met. It was a trust that transcended species, culture, and language. It was pure, unspoken, and powerful. "You're the first to come," Zephra said softly, as if speaking to herself. "No one else heard me. No one else cared." Derek felt a knot tighten in his chest. Her words lingered, echoing in his mind, cutting through the guilt and helplessness he had been trying to push aside. He wasn't here just to help her. He was here to prove that humanity was more than the war machines and soldiers sent to conquer alien worlds. He was here to show that, no matter the odds, humanity could offer something that wasn't based on violence or conquest. Something far more precious: compassion. "I'm not leaving you," Derek said, his voice steady now, a promise. He wasn't sure he could keep, but knew he had to make. "I'll find a way to help. We'll find a way." Zephyr's face softened for the first time since he had arrived, the fear in her eyes easing slightly as she looked at him. "Thank you, human," she whispered as Derek reached into his pack. His mind raced. He had to find something, anything. In his training, he'd been taught to improvise in any situation, to survive with the little he had. Maybe this was his test, the ultimate test of his resolve as a human, as a soldier, and as someone who still believed in the good in the universe. He rummaged through his pack, pulling out everything he had left: antiseptic wipes, a syringe, bandages, a small flare for signaling. None of it would cure the boy's illness, but maybe it would buy them more time. Maybe time was all they needed. Derek turned to Zifra, his voice breaking through the silence. "This will help for now. I don't have the medicine you need, but I can try to stabilize him. I'll keep him alive until we figure something out." Zifra nodded, clutching her son tighter. "I will do anything to help him survive." "Thank you, human," she said again, her voice filled with gratitude. Derek felt the weight of her words, but they didn't make the situation any easier. His chest tightened as he began working, trying to keep his hands steady as he carefully injected the boy with a dose of antibiotics, praying that it would help, even if just for a few hours. As he worked, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this encounter, was about something bigger than just one alien mother and her child. It was about connection, about compassion, about humanity proving that, even in the face of impossible odds, they could make a difference. And in that moment, Derek realized something else. He wasn't just saving them. He was saving himself. The tension grows. The storm had become a relentless force of nature, thrashing against the shelter with an intensity that felt like it might tear the world apart. The sound of the wind howling outside was deafening, but inside, there was a fragile silence. Derek knelt beside the alien child, his hands working feverishly to stabilize him with whatever little he had left. His thoughts raced, but his body moved on autopilot. Every instinct he had screamed that time was running out. Zifra sat beside him, her face drawn with exhaustion, her eyes never leaving her son. Her gaze was filled with a quiet intensity, a mix of hope and fear. She had seen her people fall to illness and disease, and now her child lay on the edge of life and death. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. She trusted him, a human, someone she had just met, someone who had no reason to help, but she trusted him with her child's life. Derek didn't know how long he had been working, but it felt like an eternity. The child's breathing was still shallow, his tiny chest rising and falling in painful rhythm. His body was still burning with fever, and Derek's meager efforts weren't enough to bring it down. He could see the boy's skin beginning to lose its color again, and his heart sank. The storm outside seemed to reflect the storm inside Derek's mind. Every passing second felt like it could be his last chance to save them. If only he had more resources, more knowledge of alien biology. But all he had were his hands, his training, and his determination to do what no one else had bothered to do: show compassion. "We're losing him," Zifra whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. She reached out a trembling hand, gently touching her son's forehead. "He's slipping away from me." Derek clenched his jaw, his hands shaking as he worked to administer another dose of the makeshift medicine he had managed to put together. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be all right, but he knew the truth. He couldn't promise that. The odds were against them. But he couldn't let her give up either. He couldn't let her lose hope. "Stay with me, kid," Derek muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You're stronger than this." As the storm outside intensified, Derek felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had no answers, no easy fixes. All he could do was keep trying, keep fighting for them. But the minutes stretched on, and with each passing second, The tension grew. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the storm outside had somehow crept into the shelter, filling every corner with unease. Zephra's breathing was shallow now, her gaze drifting between Derek's hands and her son's pale face. "Please," she whispered, a silent plea for him to do more, to pull a miracle from thin air. Her voice, once filled with fierce determination, was now fragile, broken. Derek could feel the pressure of her stare, the weight of her hopes resting on his shoulders. He wasn't a medic, and he wasn't a healer. He was just a soldier, trained for combat, trained to survive. But in this moment, he was more than that. He was their only chance. The minutes felt like hours. Derek's heart was pounding in his chest, his hands drenched with sweat, despite the cold winds howling outside. The child's fever was rising again, the boy's skin glowing with an unnatural warmth. Every time Derek looked at Zephra, he saw the fear in her eyes, the terror that she might lose everything. But Derek couldn't allow that to happen. He couldn't let this be the end for them. He grabbed the flare from his kit, his hands shaking as he sparked it, the bright orange light casting long shadows across the room. It was a long shot, but the flare would signal any passing ship, any vessel that could help. It was the only signal he had left. The storm might block it, but it was a chance, a small, flickering chance that someone out there might hear them. Zephra's eyes widened as she saw the flare light up the dim room. What is that?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion and hope. "It's a signal," Derek replied, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "It's all I can do right now. I'm sending a call for help. We'll get you the medicine you need. I won't give up on you." Zephra's face softened, the smallest glimmer of hope returning to her features. She didn't fully understand what the signal meant, but she understood the gesture. Derek wasn't giving up. He was fighting for them. The flare burned brightly in the dark room, casting shadows on the walls, flickering with the promise of hope. The storm still raged outside, but in that moment, the air felt lighter. For the first time since Derek had arrived, it felt like the storm wasn't the enemy. The storm was just a part of their battle, a battle that was far from over. The heartbreaking choice. Derek stood in the middle of the shelter, the flare still burning brightly in his hand. The storm outside had not relented, and the violent winds were only growing stronger. The roar of the storm was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the silent weight pressing down on his chest. The boy was still burning with fever, and despite everything Derek had tried, nothing seemed to be working. Zephra sat beside her child, her face a mask of fear and exhaustion. She had been so strong, holding on to hope with every ounce of her being, but now the reality was settling in. She could feel it in the trembling of her hands, in the deep ache of her heart. Her son was slipping away, and there was nothing more she could do. Derek's efforts, her own attempts to care for him, all seemed so small in the face of what was happening. The child's breathing was growing weaker, and the air felt thinner in the room, heavy with the impending loss. Derek's mind was racing. He had promised her he wouldn't give up, that he would save them. But what if there was no saving him? What if this was the end? The flare's orange glow flickered, casting long, eerie shadows around them. Derek looked at the flare, and for a moment, he thought about the chance he had taken. The signal was a desperate one, a long shot. There was no guarantee that anyone would hear it, but what else could he do? What else could he try? Zephra noticed his hesitation. Her eyes, filled with fear and pain, locked onto his. "What is it?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. "What are you thinking?" Derek hesitated, his gaze flickering between the flare and the child. I need to go," he said quietly, almost as if the words were foreign to him. "There's a depot not too far from here. I think I can get some more supplies. Maybe something to help him. It's risky, but I have to try." Zephra's eyes widened, and she shook her head. "No, Derek, you can't leave. The storm. It's too dangerous. And you don't even know if you'll find anything. You're our only hope." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the raw emotion breaking through her composed exterior. "Please, you can't leave us. If you go, there's no one else." Derek felt the weight of her words, and his heart clenched. He had never been good at making decisions like this. He was a soldier, a fighter, not a healer, not someone who could hold the weight of someone else's life on his shoulders. But here, in the face of this alien mother's pain, he felt the magnitude of what he was being asked to do. He could hear the child's labored, breathing in the silence that had fallen between them. It was like a ticking clock, each breath growing more shallow, more desperate. Derek looked at Zephra, and in her eyes he saw the raw terror of a mother who knew she was about to lose everything. She was clinging to him, to whatever thread of hope he represented. He clenched his fists, feeling the strain in his chest as if the decision was physically breaking him. The mission he had been sent on, the mission that had gotten him stranded, here in the first place, was all but forgotten. This wasn't about orders anymore. This was about survival, not just for him, but for them, for her child. Derek glanced back at the shelter door, then to the flare in his hand, the dim glow illuminating their faces. He could hear the storm raging outside, feel the overwhelming pressure in his chest, and yet, a small stubborn part of him refused to believe it was over. "Zephra," Derek said, his voice firm but laced with uncertainty, "I'll go. I'll get the supplies. I won't be gone long." Her expression shifted, a mixture of fear and relief flooding her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't want him to go. She wanted him to stay too. Keep fighting for them, for her child. But she understood. There was no more time to waste. "I'll be right back," Derek promised, his voice strained but determined. He grabbed his pack and pulled the straps tight, preparing for the dangerous journey ahead. The wind screamed as if warning him not to leave, but Derek didn't flinch. He was determined, but the doubt gnawed at him. What if it was too late? What if the storm was too powerful? Zephra stood up shakily and walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "Please, hurry," she whispered, her voice filled with unspoken emotion. She didn't need to say more. He could see it in her eyes. He gave her a tight nod and walked toward the shelter door. As his hand touched the handle, he turned back one last look at Zephra and her son, the small, fragile family he had come to care for in such a short time. They were all he had now. The storm howled louder as he stepped outside, the biting cold immediately hitting his face. It felt like an impossible battle, but Derek had made his choice. He had to make it work. The unlikely rescue Derek pushed through the howling storm, the wind cutting against his face like 1,000 sharp needles. Every step felt like a battle, the sand whipping into his eyes and blinding him momentarily. But he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. The journey to the supply depot was treacherous, the terrain unfamiliar and hostile. The storm made it worse, blurring his path and adding to the weight of his growing doubts. He had no guarantee that he would even find the depot. He had no idea if it would hold the supplies they so desperately needed. And yet, something deep inside him, the same thing that had made him stay when every instinct told him to walk away, pushed him forward. He had to try. He had promised Zephra that he wouldn't give up, and in that moment, as the wind screamed and the world around him threatened to swallow him whole, he refused to let her down. Every breath burned in his chest, the cold air cutting into him like knives. His body screamed for rest, but he ignored it, focusing only on the task ahead. The child, the sick little alien boy, was still on his mind. Every breath he took seemed to echo in Derek's head. Would he be alive when Derek returned? Or had the storm taken him already? After what felt like an eternity, Derek's eyes finally caught a glimpse of something ahead, of faint, flickering light. It was distant, barely visible through the sand and storm, but it was enough. Hope surged in him, an almost physical thing that pushed him to move faster. His legs burned, his breath ragged, but he pressed on, refusing to stop until he reached it. He stumbled into the depot, exhausted and barely able to stay on his feet, but the sight of the place, untouched by the storm, gave him a surge of relief. There were crates of medical supplies, tech, and other resources stacked neatly, as though someone had been waiting for him to arrive. Without wasting a second, Derek dug through the crates, pulling out everything he thought could help medicine. Syringes, even a med kit for an alien species he'd never encountered. He stuffed them into his bag, not caring how heavy it became. Time was running out. As he turned to leave, the storm outside roared louder, as if the planet itself was warning him to turn back. But Derek ignored it, setting his eyes on the horizon, where the shelter was still visible in the distance, shrouded in mist and sand. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He couldn't afford to waste another second. The journey back was even harder. The storm had intensified, and the path seemed to grow longer with each step. The weight of the supplies slowed him, and his body screamed for rest, but Derek kept moving. Each step was a promise to the alien mother, to the child he had barely met but already felt a strange connection with. And then, just as he thought he might collapse from exhaustion, a break in the storm revealed something he hadn't expected. The light from the shelter flickered weakly in the distance. The small glow of hope he had been chasing through the night had not gone out. They were still waiting for him. When he finally reached the shelter, Derek stumbled inside, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Zephra's eyes widened as she saw him. Her face, once filled with worry, now held something else: relief, gratitude, and even a hint of disbelief. "You came back," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Derek didn't have the strength to respond. He dropped the medical supplies onto the ground and fell to his knees. The weight of everything, the storm, the journey, the promises crushing him. His body ached with exhaustion, but the look in Zephra's eyes made it all worth it. Zephra rushed to him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You saved us," she said softly, her voice trembling. I didn't believe anyone would." Derek looked up at her, his own eyes heavy with emotion. "I promised you I wouldn't leave," he said, his voice rough. "I couldn't let you down." Together, they moved to the child, who lay in the corner of the shelter, still unconscious, but alive. Derek wasted no time, opening the medical supplies and carefully preparing the medicine. He worked quickly, but with a gentle touch, applying the treatment he hoped would stabilize the child long enough for him to recover. Minutes passed, each one feeling like a lifetime, but then something miraculous happened. The boy's breathing, once shallow and strained, began to slow, becoming deeper and more steady. His skin, once pale and cold, regained a little color. Zephra gasped, a sob escaping her lips as she watched her son's body respond to the medicine. Tears filled her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled, truly smiled. He's going to be okay," she whispered in disbelief. Derek couldn't speak. He simply nodded, a weight lifting off his shoulders that he hadn't realized had been there until now. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside the shelter, a quiet peace settled over them. It wasn't over, not yet, but for the first time in days, there was hope. There was a chance. Derek didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how long they would stay on this planet, or if they would ever make it back home. But he knew one thing. For the first time in his life, he had made a real difference. A new bond. The storm had finally passed. The winds, which had once screamed through the desert like the roar of an untamable beast, had quieted, leaving a heavy stillness in the air. The morning light broke through the clouds, casting a soft golden glow over the barren landscape outside the shelter. Inside, however, There was a sense of peace that Derek hadn't expected, a calm that was almost too precious to be true. Derek sat by the small fire they had managed to build in the corner. Watching the flickering flames dance, his body ached with exhaustion, every muscle begging for rest. But there was something different about this place, now something that had shifted in him, deep in his core. He had entered this alien world as a soldier on a mission, but now, after everything they had been through, he felt like something more. Something human. Zephyra moved quietly beside him, tending to her child, who had been sleeping peacefully for several hours now, his fever gone, his color restored. The medicine Derek had risked everything to get had worked. Her child was going to live. She didn't say anything for a while, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was understanding. They both knew they had been through something life-changing. For Zephyra, Derek had been her last hope, the one person who hadn't abandoned her. She had trusted him when no one else would. And Derek, for his part, had discovered that the true power of humanity didn't lie in its weapons or its soldiers. It lay in compassion, in the willingness to fight for someone, no matter how alien they were. "Thank you," Zephyra finally sighed, her voice soft, almost a whisper. She sat down beside him, her gaze fixed on her son. "I don't think you'll ever truly understand what you've done for us." Derek smiled wearily, his eyes following her gaze. "I don't need to understand," he replied, his voice steady, though it trembled with emotion. "I just needed to do what was right." Zephyra turned her gaze back to him, her blue skin shimmering in the soft light. There was something in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before. It was gratitude, yes, but there was also a deeper connection. A bond. They had fought together against the storm, against death itself. And now, somehow they were family. "We're not so different," Zephyra said, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "You and I mean. I thought all humans were just like the ones who left us here to die. I thought you would be the same. But you're different." Derek didn't know what to say at first. He wasn't a man of many words, not the kind of man who would eloquently speak about such things. But this felt important. "I guess we all have our moments where we surprise ourselves," he said with a half smile. "Sometimes we don't know what we're capable of until we're faced with something that forces us to choose." Zephyra nodded, the faintest of smiles touching her lips. "I never thought I would find someone like you out here, alone in this desert. I thought we were lost, that we would fade into nothingness. But you gave us a chance. You gave me a chance." The child stirred in her arms, his small hands reaching out in his sleep. Zephyra gently adjusted him, her eyes full of love as she gazed down at him. "He's alive," she murmured to herself. "You saved him. You gave me back my son." Derek glanced down at the boy, now peacefully resting. His breath was even, and his skin had returned to its normal shade of soft blue. He looked like any child would, innocent, full of promise. Derek couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride swelling in his chest. This was what it meant to be human, to fight for life, to preserve it when the odds were stacked against. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Zephyra stood up, holding her son close to her chest. She walked over to the small window in the shelter and looked out at the horizon, her expression contemplative. Derek watched her, his thoughts racing. He had come here to complete a mission, but now he realized that the mission had changed. It had become something far bigger than himself. "You know," Zephyra said, breaking the silence, "I once thought that my people were the last of our kind. But now, I wonder if we were just waiting for something bigger than ourselves. Something that would connect us to others. I never thought that something would be a human." Derek stood up and walked over to her, his eyes scanning the barren landscape outside. For a moment, there was no storm, no alien world, no difference between them. There was only the shared understanding of two beings who had survived together. "There's still a lot we don't understand," Derek said quietly. "A lot we don't know, but maybe that's the point. Maybe we're all just figuring it out as we go. Zephyr looked at him, her eyes soft but strong. Maybe we are, she said. But you gave me hope when there was none left. Derek felt his heart swell with emotion, the weight of her words sinking in. He had come to this alien world expecting a mission, a task to complete. He had never expected to find something so profound, something so deeply human, in a place so far from Earth. But here, in this alien landscape, he had found something that would stay with him forever. A bond formed not by blood, but by compassion and shared survival. As Zephyr turned back to her son, Derek stepped outside the shelter for a moment. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear blue sky. For the first time since he had arrived on this planet, Derek felt a sense of peace. The weight of the mission had lifted, and in its place, something else had grown, a connection that went beyond space, beyond species, and beyond the stars themselves. Derek looked out over the alien world, feeling a strange sense of belonging, as though he were a part of something much bigger than he could ever have imagined. And as he stood there, the sun warming his face, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning.